Welcome everyone to the second episode of the RPG Sanctum. With me I have Phil Willis.
Salutations, felicitations, and jubilations, and by the way, no matter what you guys say, I'm always right.
Nathan Schlothlin.
It's Slothin, and yes, hello everyone, let's argue.
Hey, it's my shtick to screw up people's names, Roy. If you screw up people's names, you have to pay me copyright infringement fees.
Alright, and also Andrew Long.
Oh, hey.
Alright, we'll start with introductions for everyone. Phil, we already know what you do from the last episode. Nathan, what is your job handle on the site, and what do you do?
I go by the name Twin Bahamut on the site. I'm one of the main news guys, try to update every day.
Alright, and Andrew, what is your IRC handle, and what do you do?
I'm Castamel, and I do as little as possible.
Castamel is our HR person who comes around every 3 months or so.
Yeah.
Alright, anyway, we will conduct a short break before we'll get into our first segment. And we are back. We'll go ahead and start with our main topic for the night, which is what makes an RPG. Our first segment will be what defines an RPG. Phil, why don't you start us off for the night?
Well, back in the old days when I was your age, an RPG was a bunch of people sitting around a campfire rolling some dice with some pieces of paper and stuff. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll do us a little favor. Let's first read the clinical definition from our good friends, our well-established professionals at Wikipedia. A role-playing game is a broad family of games in which players assume the role of characters in a fictional setting. Players take responsibility for acting out these roles within a narrative, either through literal acting or through a process of structured decision-making or character development. Actions taken within the game succeed or fail according to a formal system of rules and guidelines. So, that's kind of like the couple of sentence definition there. I mean, essentially, a role-playing game allows you to play a character in a story that is usually set up by a video game or the dungeon master. You're playing a major character in a story, and I think one of the defining traits is that as playing a character in the story, you get to make decisions or play a critical role in that story in some way, shape, or form. And in its raw form, RPGs allow the players to totally have an impact on their world and totally do things that are totally out of the box and affect the people around them, affect the NPCs, affect the world, and whatnot. And that's why, the original forms of role-playing, the pen and paper, well, I don't know if those are like real original if you go back in ancient history, but the ones I remember as being original, they work so well because even if the Dungeon Master approached the players with a specific plot and story in mind, those players could do all kinds of whacked things and just totally throw the DM for a loop. And a good DM could roll with the punches and improvise on his feet, and the whole story would just change from maybe what the Dungeon Master had in his mind to begin with based on what these players were doing, because at the end of the day, it's the character story, and the DM is simply providing the plot structure and the setting and whatnot. Obviously, as we got into the age of computer games and console games and whatever have you, we've had to reevaluate those definitions, because now you started fitting the idea of a role-playing game and the characteristics of a role-playing game into a very limited formats that couldn't, with very limited artificial intelligence, that couldn't move the way a DM did or think the way a DM did, and half the time these things couldn't even fit 2 paragraphs on the cartridge. So they took a lot of the characteristics of RPGs, the pen and paper RPGs, such as the deep character development, as far as the rule sets and whatever have you, the battle systems, the thematic settings, the fantasy settings, and they would take as many of those elements as they could and stuff them into a game. So, I mean, that's kind of like your basic generic look at RPGs, and whatnot. And when I consider to myself what is an RPG, I compare it with the baseline pen and paper, and how many of those characteristics does that game bring to the table. And if it brings a number of those elements to the table, I don't know exactly what that number is, but if that's the focus of, if those elements if the elements of the game are RPG elements, and those are the core elements of the game, then I would consider that an RPG. And I think as we discuss this more, we'll see that you really can't just come up with a couple of bullet points and say this is an RPG and this isn't. It's kind of a fluid definition, but in my mind, it's does the game focus on the elements that characterize a role-playing game.
Right, and Nathan, for you, what would you say an RPG is in your eyes?
Well, I think I can have a very different perspective than Phil on this one. You see, I don't really like going back to pen and paper RPGs as this kind of main definition, because video game RPGs have drifted a long way since then, and I don't even think it necessarily should be the ideal video game RPGs hold to as a genre. So I don't think we should I don't agree with defining RPG as a game that's similar to pen and paper RPGs.
I don't mean similar to pen and paper RPGs, but that the core elements of the video game have I don't know exactly how to put this into words, but have the spirit, the spirit of the characteristics of the pen and paper RPG. Which, I mean, the whole spirit behind the pen and paper RPG was to draw the character in the world through decision making, deep character creation systems, solid rule sets, and decisive decision making, for example. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's got to be GURPS or it's got to be D&D in order to qualify as an RPG.
Well, you see, that's actually kind of my very point. You see, things like this deep decision-making and complex character creation are things I find actually utterly unessential to the core idea of what is an RPG. After all, everyone can name a great number of things which are widely known as RPGs that have no amount of character creation or no major places where the player makes a major story decision.
Well, those aren't the only elements. I only put those out there as a number of suggestions. Drawing you into a deep world, having a deep story where you have an impact on it, not necessarily through decision making, but maybe your character just has an impact on the world.
Well, I know. It's just these are things that are commonly brought up as core ideas of RPG, and I just want to counteract that point. I don't agree with it. You see, in my mind, RPGs are basically about one thing. RPGs are about characters. They're about the idea of character development, in both in a story sense and also very much more importantly in a kind of gameplay mechanical sense. Games that are built around the idea of characters growing and becoming stronger in various ways, at its core, that's what an RPG is.
So Ratchet and Clank, where you have a character who as he's playing through the game gains experience points, his ability to use the weapons increases, his he does have a progression as a character in the story as well. Would that be an RPG? Because, I mean, this is what we're having this discussion about, because you are seeing some RPG elements be brought into more mainstream games or whatever have you. But, you could even go back to Castlevania 2, where they took the essential essence of what was a Castlevania game, but they overlaid it with a character development system with experience points, and as you gain levels, you'd move up from there. What about Zelda 2 as well, where one of the big differences between Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 was the experience point system, and as you gain levels, you would gain new abilities. So in a manner of speaking, your character was developing and growing.
Well, I think when you're applying in terms of a video game sense, you really can't apply this whole a person taking on a role in the video game sense, because in that sense, almost every game is an RPG in that sense. Everything from Mario to Zelda is an RPG in that sense, if you're just playing a character.
Well, I kind of got the impression that we were talking about, though, if the character development, as far as he gains experience, he grows, not necessarily as a character in the story, because that's going to happen regardless, but, I mean, hopefully, if it's a halfway decent written story, but rather he grows in power and abilities and whatnot, either through some sort of experience or skill point system or whatever have you.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that is kind of core to what an RPG is, but almost anyone's definition, I think. However, things like, it's a kind of thing that an RPG puts this this particular element at the very center of the game. It's one of the most important aspects of the game that defines the game. That's the thing that differentiates an RPG from, say, a game with RPG elements, because there are many games which have things that gain experience and grow levels, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're RPGs.
But then there's also a lot of games that have, in-depth stories that don't include necessarily those same elements. So I think it's a really fluid definition that is going to differ from person to person. I mean, even if a company calls a game an RPG, it doesn't necessarily end up being one in the strictest sense of the word. So I think it all comes down to your personal preference. And I mean, we could argue over an exact definition for it for hours, but I mean, the majority of them, I would say, include those basic D&D mathematical formulas at their base, underneath, layers of programming, obviously, and the character development and the exploration intertwined. And I think when you find things that have RPG elements, they're missing one of those critical things that would, make you consider a game an RPG.
Yeah, there's definitely no doubt that there's a lot of fluidity to the definition of RPG. It's simply true, no one really agrees on what it means in any kind of strict taxonomical sense. But I mean, there are a lot of tendencies we can discuss.
I mean, I would say that I would agree with if it has RPG elements as the focus of the the gameplay and the experience itself, then I would certainly consider it an RPG. But whereas you tend to focus on just that growth mechanic, I think I would broaden that up to the other mechanics as well. Because what if I had a game that maybe had the decision-making processes of Dragon Age Origins, but let's just say that in Dragon Age the characters actually never leveled up. They were stuck at level 1. And you get a little bit, you're kind of seeing a few games like that. We were kind of discussing Magicka earlier, how your character actually starts out in Magicka with all of the abilities right from the get-go. It's as you play it, you as a player actually just become more proficient in their use. But there is no actual leveling up. There is no learning new spells or anything like that. Now, we're not going to talk about Magicka and whether or not that's an RPG, but let's just say, for sake of argument, that you had, kind of Magicka where...
Wait, can I intervene? I actually have the perfect game to discuss for this very subject. The Way of the Samurai series. In my opinion, the decisions in Dragon Age pale in comparison to the kind of meaningful decisions you make in The Way of the Samurai series. There's just no comparison. The Way of the Samurai series is a game where you start as a guy walking into a town. You can do anything. You can just walk through the town and leave, and the game will end. You can die, the game will end. Or you can become a bandit lord, sign up with some other guys and become the champion of some corrupt dictator, or you can just betray them all and try to conquer everything for yourself. That's the kind of thing is the way the Samurai is built around. Nothing but meaningful decisions. Yet, I don't think Way of the Samurai is an RPG.
But it sounds like it, because you're really role-playing this character. I mean, that's what role-playing is. It's being able to be inside the shoes of a person in a fictional world. And the way that you really make me feel as a person in a fictional world is giving me free choice, or giving me, deep mechanics, leveling up, or you're giving me lots of choice, as much choice as possible in that game, whether it's choices in the storyline, choices in the character development, deep choices in the battle system, as opposed to the traditional, let's say, I guess the dynamic opposite of that would be a traditional first-person shooter, where I'm shooting things on rails. I don't get any choices at all in how the character levels up. I get no choices at all in the story. I'm just there to kind of walk through the experience and shoot people in the head. I mean, this sounds like to me that even though there's not a leveling up mechanic, it sounds to me to be a really great definition of what an RPG is, since you basically are supposed to, it sounds like you're supposed to put yourself in the samurai shoes or whatever have you, and then do whatever the heck you want.
Well, Phil, how do you categorize a game such as like your standard JRPG, where you're going through the story and you're playing the character? However,